Is the U.S. presidential election for 2024 a critical point? Something that is going to change something for a considerable amount of time as well as ending something. I'm Rich Paulson for Critical Point, and it is August 6, 2024. And this is a little discussion of what's going on in neoliberalism, as well as some of the research of what goes on generation to generation and sequences of generation, the research done by Strauss and Howe. All right, let's get started. This chart that I'm showing you is an annual chart of the U.S. stock market. Now, it does go way back to the start of 1800, so that's before what we think of a normal stock market. That may include even some European, and it's basically just a paleo stock market. But from 1880s to date, we have what's really the modern stock index data and prices and whatnot. Okay, what we want to show here is I have labels of supercycles. I have there's four types of supercycles. I'm only showing the three most important of how they work for fluctuations throughout the history of the stock market for the US. And then I drew a line here to just remind us of the trend since the 1930s, 1950s that I'm going to call the neoliberalism trend. And then from the research from Strauss and Howe, I set up these lines here for about 20 years, which is the length of a generation. And then there's four generations that can be shown as like seasons of a lifelong cycle. And I'll explain more of that in a moment. But first, let's discuss neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is said to be about the idea of less government, more business, more freedom for the individual, less we, more I, me, okay? It's also about more global trade. So a lot more free market capitalism type thinking. Neoliberalism probably kicked in at about 1950s and then built in over time, and then by 1980 shifted into overdrive, if you will. But it's possible it started in the 1930s. It's possible economist Hayek might have even used the word neoliberalism. I'm not sure about that. But he probably was one of the first economists to talk about it. But there's been similarities long before these economists, and you know, capitalism has been around for some people say 500 years, I say longer than that. And these kind of things have come and go. But this neoliberalism, I think you want to think in terms of starting out as a counter-revolution in the 1930s to 1950s, and it didn't work that well in the 30s and 40s, as if no one was going to listen to them. And the reason is, in the 30s and 40s, we had disasters. We had the Great Depression that was not only U.S. but global. We had World War II by the 1940s. And that pulled us together as a people. We had to be a family, a community, and therefore there was more government and there was stronger, more powerful institutions. And therefore the individual was kind of like in second place. And business also had to be used and forced to help out in World War II. We had to change what we were doing economically to rebuild ourselves faster and pull ourselves out of that depression. So even though the neoliberalism was there, it was kind of like more of a talking point than anything. But once we get past, get into 1950s on towards, we just see more of pushing. And by the time we get to 1960s, 70s, when we have the hippies, we actually see hippies anti-government, but we also see conservative people, youngsters, around with their thick, wide-rimmed glasses and their white shirts and black ties. They were also anti-government. So we see this convergence from both sides to try to work away from it, and it was more of the conservative side that finally won with the election of President Reagan, which I assume is a symbol that we went from counter-revolution to a revolution and won. And what was the ones that won were the conservative, pro-market, pro-business, pro-free market type factions of our population and our thinking and of our economy and doing business. And from 1980 on, we can see it then built more along those lines and eventually just made the rich richer. And we can see by today, this neoliberalism is burning out, and some who have been speaking for it now are actually saying, some of them even saying it's failed. And more of them are just saying, if it didn't fail, they're saying, it's ending. Something else must take the place. We've pushed it too hard, too far, made the rich way too rich. We've had way too big companies. We've got too much of monopolies and oligarchies. We have people on both sides, Republican, Democrat, tearing down global trade, which we gave way too many jobs away to China and other countries, and so did other countries. It's not just us tearing down neoliberalism. It is kind of a global platform as well as a global movement. And it looks like it's tearing down, ending. And I must say it's ending with a failure, even though it worked along the way, at least making the rich richer. But it did actually help the middle class and poor in the 80s and 90s. But by the 2000s, they started falling behind. The rich were basically just taking everything. And it's made a very disgruntled people, stressed out people, overworked people. So all our politics suck. I've been saying we're in corruptive times, the great corruption. Everything's corrupted: religion, politics, education, healthcare, philosophy, our free markets, capitalism, business, all corrupt. Everything's messed up. Okay. So at any rate, I say this neoliberalism is ending. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look at the end or look at the length of this, the time, it's similar to research done by Strauss and Howe, and Howe's no longer with us. Strauss is no longer with us. Howe has a new book that I haven't seen yet. I think it's out or is coming out, giving you the latest update. They've written several books from 1991 to current, but I believe their 1997 book, The Fourth Turning, is one of the more famous of explaining what they're doing. And they start with an 85-year life cycle. They're basically taking the life of a person, and they're breaking that into 4 seasons that they've related to generations. And they're using a definition of a generation about 20 years, which is similar to others. I think it really runs 17 to 27, 28 years, wider than most would say. Most would say it's a little over 20 years, okay? And you can see that they've put these into like the millennials, the Xers, the Gen Xers, the Gen Zers, the quiet generation, the lost generation, the baby boomers, okay, those kind of things, all right? So they break that 85-year life cycle into 4 seasons, and it's basically 4 generations, but it's probably best to call them seasons because they can be combinations of at least 3 out of 4 of those generations, with one generation as being the children at that time. So it's unlikely they made a big impact on politics and economy and business, okay? Any rate, if we take that 85-year life cycle, it suddenly dawned on me, this is probably about the length of this neoliberalism. And I'm working now on the 1800s and 1700s and 1600s and think I can come up with things that might be similar to neoliberalism, totally opposite, something else, something different. But I suspect we're looking at 70 to over 100 years. Howe says 80 years to over 104 years for that life cycle, so it's not a precise number. And I think it does relate to my business cycle analysis when the 2008-2000 financial crisis was probably a symbol of starting what they call a crisis generation, a crisis season. But really, relative to neoliberalism, I think it was the warning that we burned it out. It's ending. And I think we've seen the worst of the stock market problems for what may last as a crisis period from 2000s to 2020s, which I'll explain in a moment. At any rate, I think neoliberalism is ending. I think this election is very, very important, whether it's ending or not, whether we're changing and what are we changing to. If it's not this one, then maybe I need to say and or 2028 election. And then I think that's pretty much it, okay? And I say we are going to launch something entirely different. Now, there's someone out there that I have not researched well enough, but it's a Mr. Wright who wrote in 2006 of something of progressive realism. And there are some people thinking that's the next thing we're going to do, and apparently do for many decades. If it's the life cycle, we've had a crisis in the 1930s, starting of a life cycle. Then we had a crisis 2000s to now, ending the life cycle and starting the next life cycle. So in theory, the next crisis is towards the end of this century. Well, as it turns out, my model analysis here, I'm showing this crisis an SC2, and what it's saying is we're probably going to get an SC3 crisis around 2050, another bear market down 40 or 60% in the stock market. Somehow we'll rebuild, move on, and extend that life cycle all the way to about 2090 when I'm expecting another SC2. Okay, that can be 70 or 90% down, but possibly only 40 or 60% down. We got a new statistic out of this one that I correctly forecast it wouldn't be as severe, and we now have to consider maybe the next one won't be as severe. Maybe something's evolving and changing here. But I thought it was fascinating about my model is saying we're going to have a significant bear market, super cycle problem, a crisis about 2090, and I'm looking at Strauss and Howe's work, and it's saying a crisis about that time. Okay, so I think I'm going to be paying more attention to their research as well as blending it in with my own here and perhaps others. All right, so anyways, if we break, let's move now beyond neoliberalism and say there's something about this election and next election that's going to end. I suppose Trump could win and launch something that's going to last for 70 or 80 years, but I'm concerned we're going to have a lot more pain, problems, frustrations, maybe even death and revolutions along the way till we clean it up. And in other words, Trump will probably be short term, and that extremism will be short term, but it could then settle into something calmer, nicer, pull us together as a people, and might yet be somewhere along that direction. But I don't think so. I think it's going to be that really the Trumpsters and hard right-wingers are second to third, fourth, fifth, 10th place or something like that. So I suspect Harris, even if Harris doesn't accomplish a lot, maybe the symbol kind of like President Reagan, but in a different direction, when we can launch this new life cycle of 85 years here. And you're still going to see a mixture of right wing, left wing, and voting, and everybody's going to be flip flopping back and forth. We've always done it, and we always will do it, unless, of course, we get into a monarchy dictatorship. But I think that won't last that long, and we'll throw that out. But there are some wild cards on the Trump side that could extend this crisis period we're in even further. And the weird thing is, later on, though, actually create the new path for a very long time. And there's even Steve Bannon, who likes this generational theory and has been hopeful for a crisis, help even create it. And this is the writings of others about Steve Bannon. I don't know that he has said anything like this. But it's just another symbol of a group, a movement out there that they would like to create a crisis in order to get in there and change things the way they want and hang on to it. And they would probably blame the crisis on everyone else, even if they're the ones that wind up creating it at the start. And I'm a little concerned the Project 2025 can be too deep, too broad, and also done in a very short period of time that we'll find our economy and our debt and everything else is just too sensitive and people too sensitive, and it might create the crisis. And maybe they can still pull that off saying, yes, but that's the pain we needed to take to clean things up, straighten things up, and we'll be okay later. And they might actually pull that off. On the other hand, it might be the death of them that we throw them out and get rid of them. Okay. So I look at the easier way and the quite possibly the better, more profitable way in the stock market to run a business, and it probably is to go with Harris. So my modeling, not only of what I'm discussing today, but all the other things I've done for many years and learned over decades here, really is favoring Harris winning. And one of the best forecasters, who actually was one of the few to forecast Trump getting elected in 2016, and then he also forecast Biden getting elected in 2020, he says Harris will win. So I think Harris is the one that's going to put an end to this. I'm not saying Harris the person or even the Democrats, but it's some kind of a symbol of we're going to come together and make some changes. But I could be wrong on that. Maybe it has to wait to the 2028 election. And maybe Trump can come in and it still works out okay anyways, but I'm a little concerned it's actually more of a disaster and a buffoon time. But I'm willing to go and be open-minded and allow that as well. But we're coming to some kind of a critical point where this election is very, very important, and or the next one. And then I think we see a little less importance later on as we settle into something next decade. So now let's go with Strauss and Howe's work. And what they did is they broke it down to the critical generation, if you can see my mouse here, the critical generation, or we'll call them seasons because it is more complicated than that. It's multiple generations at the same time, but apparently there is a leader generation doing it. The crisis generation, I have it as 1920s, 1930s. But people tell me, no, you should shove that out to 1929, 1930s and then spill that over into the 1940s, into World War II. And that probably is the more accurate time to look at it. But the crisis generation, everything falls apart, everything's, and then what happens is the younger people then become the next generation and they become the high generation. And the high generation actually helps create this turn out of that crisis and make things better. But the high generations or seasons have been known to be strong institutions, so likely more government. But it's also smarter, better government, and people just like the idea of it. They work with it, deal with it. They come together as a better community. Okay, whereas today with all this pro-business, pro-free market, it's like we're all on our own here, and then we join these weird groups and we're just really screwed up, okay? Well, it's because we're in the crisis generation yet again. You can see I've drawn this from 2000s, 2010s, but some people are saying, yeah, I ought to push that out to the early 2000s and a little further, maybe even push it out to the financial crisis and push it in towards the end of this decade. And I agree with that, okay? We'll talk about that in a moment. So this high generation actually can see created a fantastic bull market in the stock market. We survived World War II. We survived the financial crisis, the depression, okay, and the economic blowout. All right, we survived dictators and Hitler and all that. And it was happy-go-lucky, go-get-'em kind of thing, even though it was more pro-government. Then comes the awakening generation or season, and what they were doing is starting to say, hey, wait a minute, I'd like a little more personal freedom. Hey, wait a minute, I don't want so much government. We got to start changing and tearing this down a little bit. Well, this was the 1960s, 70s, when both conservatives and liberals were becoming more aggressive, doing things a bit differently at least, and it's like both were becoming anti-government. The hippies and everybody else were becoming anti-government. Okay, then we move into the 1980s to 1990s, and it becomes the unraveling generation or season, and that was basically just tearing everything down. And I remember writing maybe as soon as the 2000s, but if not, then the 2010s. I said, I'm coming to the conclusion all these Republicans are doing is tearing down what we built from the 1930s to now, and they're returning us back to the 1800s, which really was not a great time. The economy over 100 years grew about 1,000%, and yet from 1930s to date, the economy has grown over 10,000%. A much better economy, bigger economy, okay, more stuff in our lives, more active, getting things done. And yet, for some reason, they want to tear that all apart. They can't seem to appreciate what they actually built in neoliberalism. I don't think they even built it, okay? They're so infatuated with blaming everyone else and tearing everyone else down, they don't realize what they actually built. And I've often said, when they won the revolution in 1980, by the 1990s, they were actually flipping back to Revolutionary War type stuff on today, instead of recognizing, hey, we won, now we need to manage, and we need to be accountable, and we need to be able to debate and deal, and we have to let some things go that we can't get, and to do things that other people like, so we come together as a group. They didn't get that, okay? And instead, we've gone on with make the rich richer, and everybody else is going downhill now, and everybody's basically turning into a slave to a few companies and the wealthy and a financial system. And we are seeing financialization, and there's some young economists coming out there saying, wow, we got to do away with this. Well, we're going to, and we're going to start changing soon here, okay? So at any rate, we come out of the unraveling into the crisis period. And this is where the unraveling gets carried away, maybe some of the awakening, and we wind up repeating history of crisis, and we had a crisis. Early 2000s, Y2K, other types of blowout. Then we had the financial crisis, my model correctly forecast, and even called the bottom, the same month of the bottom to the stock market, and I turned long-term bullish and said, let's not be bearish to 2018 to 2020, except for shorter-term moves and stuff like that. And so we got the financial crisis, all right? So this whole crisis range should be shoved out a bit. And from what I understand, not only does Steve Bannon and some of these other groups on the right-wing side are looking at this kind of stuff, and they're trying to use it to their advantage, which I'm a little concerned it's misuse and abuse, which is why I don't think they'll get what they want, but they may cause a lot of problems along the way. Then again, you never know. Maybe if they caused a big crash, maybe that's how we actually clean things up, and they might go on something different than what they thought or was trying for, but it might also be a lot more different than what Harris will be trying for, okay? Now, Bill Gates also followed this stuff from what I understand and was looking for a pandemic, a problem. I don't know if he understood it was going to be COVID, but by the time COVID came, he said, hey, I warned you, we should be preparing for this. Instead, we're turning our back on it and it's going to make it worse. Well, from what I understand, Bill Gates is thinking we got another crisis coming here by 2030, into this decade. I think he's talking health-wise, okay, but maybe he's talking society. I don't know if he's talking about economy, business, or not, but I think he's a firm believer this has a big gone to go. Well, there's other writers and analysts of this, and maybe even Howe's on the same path. I've been watching some of his podcasts on YouTube, and Howe says, probably a crisis coming yet to polish this off, finish this off here by 2030. Whereas I'm leaning towards that if Harris gets elected, I got a feeling the crisis will be reduced, subdued, and may not even show up, that it's all over. It was basically over with COVID and the financial crisis of the 2000s and basically burning out on Trump, that I warned I was a little concerned Trump would be ending something that was started many, many decades rather than starting something new. But who knows? Maybe they'll start something new. I'm trying to be open-minded and allow something from the right that's good, but it's not really adding up that way, and we just have to keep an eye out for that, okay? At any rate, we're in this crisis period that should be ending, and for the 2030, 40s, we should be returning to the high period, which, interesting enough, was the 1940s, 1950s. Interesting enough, we had a very strong bull market. My modeling is not really favoring a strong bull market, but I'm not that sure, and I don't have upside targets for 2030s all the way out to 2100s, but I do have downside targets. I think about 2050 will be down 40 or 60%. I think around 2090 will be down 40 to 90%. I think in early 2100s will be down 40 or 60%. I think mid to late 2100s will be down 40 to 90%, more likely 70 or 90%, and it could even be a revisit of the 1930s. But until then, I really don't see any chance for a 1930s event this decade unless the debt blows up on us. And I've been saying no one can predict the debt. I've been saying that ever since I was a child and started learning some of this stuff. And I did learn it as a child. I was into the stock market as a child. And I will say, I've been more right than everybody else. You cannot predict the debt to predict the end of the world. It's going to be something else that will do it, and the debt makes it worse, and the debt finally implodes. But I don't doubt there is a level of too much debt that it can cause that problem on its own. I'm just saying I don't think anybody's smart enough to predict it. I know I'm not. And so what I'm saying is if it hits, it's probably going to hit with one of these super cycles. So that's 2050, 2090, early 2100s, late 2100s. And if it had to hit with the most important, it's not going to hit the late 2100s. Well, I don't know if I buy into that. Latest, I think, is to 2090, and then something's going to blow up. But it might even blow up on 2050, and maybe that actually makes it worse than the downside of 40 or 60%. Maybe we get new statistics that instead of having less downside out of these super cycle problems and these crises, maybe we get even more. So how I view it is the debt implosion will probably be a random event, but will probably have to link itself with a super cycle downturn. So at least we'll know about the time, and it's just debatable how bad. There is a minor supercycle going to hit 2030. Maybe it can link to that. And maybe that's also more on the Trump side of something to really blow up, okay? But right the moment on the Harris side, I don't see any kind of debt issues, and I'm convinced we can print much more money. We've been printing money for thousands of years, and we've been devaluing our currencies for thousands of years. We've had inflation for thousands of years. As far as I'm concerned, it can go on forever. The debt side's a little bit different. We do see history where countries just blew up because it was too much. And the way I look at it, next decade, we better get serious about making changes to protect ourselves from future decades of when it'll finally blow up. But I don't think it's blowing up this decade unless it's on the Trump side and a monarchy and a dictatorship. And then I see problems all around the world, crashing moments. Maybe we will get a 1929 crash. But I don't think that's what's going to occur. Somehow we'll get through that even and recover and it'll be all right. And where eventually, obviously. But with Harris, then I just see an opening here where we can shove things later that by the time the right-wingers come back, they really don't have the impact. And the younger Republicans are getting tired of this. They're just tired of it. And they're starting to open up and say, yeah, we need to do something to debt, but we also need to help the middle class and poor. They're starting to talk a little bit like Democrats. That's how it should work. And by the way, my opinion, the Republican Party will disappear if they stay the way they are. Probably by 2050s and later, they won't exist. But my guess is they will exist, but they'll flip to perhaps being the exact opposite. And if you look at Republicans today, they're nothing like the Republicans in President Reagan day when I voted for Reagan. But today, I'm not voting Republican. I see too much risk there. I don't see enough profit for me. I don't see enough good enough future for me. So I can't go there. It doesn't mean they aren't right on some things. And it doesn't mean I can't deal and work with it and make money out of it. I'm just saying I don't see it as the best way of going. And as I look at the younger generations coming Republicans and even in some of the Democrats, I think there's that chance we're going to pull together by next decade, and we may even start it now, and somehow come up with some common ground and get some things done and make some things better. And but I'm not convinced that means to a fantastic stock market, because I also think eventually, yes, we're going to tax the rich more. And I think some of these Republicans are going to help out with that. So the moderates are coming. It's just a matter of finishing things up here with Trump. And the way I look at it, if Trump doesn't get this election, I don't see how he can get another one. He's just too old and this and that. So I think you'll see him diffuse and become even more Republican and that kind of thing. Now I'm throwing a lot of my personal stuff here, which can be just flat out wrong, every bit of it. But I'm willing to bet my stock market model will be right no matter what. And I'm willing to bet my economy model will be right no matter what. So a lot of this political stuff probably doesn't matter. But I'm just fascinated now with this neoliberalism that we are at a turning point that occurs maybe once or twice in your lifetime, generally just once. That this thing is going to change, that we're going to set something for the next 70 or 80 years and then have another crisis and set up something different again. And those 4 generations are going to play a role in it, and the millennials are now going to become the more important. Right at the moment, we're switching to Gen Xers, the millennials. So what we're seeing is, look at Harris's age. Okay, so you can see we're starting to rotate. So I think it's next the Republicans are going to start coming up with younger people for the presidency. All right, dig into some more. I think this is fascinating stuff. It might be a little bit scary. It might really hurt us. It might be very good. But I'm assuming it's actually very optimistic for the rest of the century, but different. And I think where we're going to be separate from all this Howe Strauss stuff and this neoliberalism stuff, I must say my social country nation stuff that I've been doing over the years suggests by 2050, 2080s, we'll be working less and less and less and making the same or more. The rich will be going downhill. The middle class and poor would have already won. In other words, I think we'll work into that. We're going to do this going into the 2050s, 2080s. It's where we enjoy it in the 2050s and 2080s, which I probably won't be around to do that. But I think we'll be a calmer, better, middle class, poor type thing. Well, that can reduce how well the stock market does. But I think eventually the stock market catches on to that and says, okay, if we have a company that's making very little profit under the old system, which would be our current system today, they're going to say under the old system, that would have been a very high profit company. So therefore, we're going to pay just as much for that company, because what's reason it's a low profit is it has additional expenses such as helping its employees more, helping the community, helping the country, helping the world. We might even force and push them to do more R&D, and we better. And they may have to pay more in business taxes, or maybe because they're doing all those things, they get a tax break. But the point is, it's just less profits left over for the investor. But the investor, since the investor really doesn't make most of their money from the actual company. They get dividends, but that's a small part. These buybacks are a huge part of making such a great stock market, but there's no reason why we need to be knocking out 20% in the stock market. We can get by at 8, 10% in the stock market, so we don't have to do so much buybacks, okay? But other than that, the only way you make money in the stock market is the next idiot down the road has to pay you more than you paid for it. And that's all it is. And that's the kind of system it is. The company doesn't really pay you more. They are with the buybacks that we're doing more than ever. But, it's getting a bit sickening. I love the stock market. I almost worship the stock market. It's my life, although I'm trying to do other things in life now and get out there and do something else after 40 years of nothing but markets. Okay, actually talk to someone instead of talking to myself and a computer all the time. All right, but at the same time, though, I can see even I can get by with less profits from the stock market. And I think we're going to go there, and I think we can still have a really good stock market. I think this is fascinating stuff. You can agree or disagree with me, but I think whether any of us are right or know for sure what's going on or not, this is a change. All right, it's going to be a major change now in the next few years. It'll come and go, and have its battles, and things may have to get worse first, and then swing the other way. But ultimately, I'm very, very convinced we're setting a brand new path all the way to late this century. In sight of that, I'm very convinced we're setting a path here, something new that can very well be, Strauss and Howe are right, we're setting in a new high season or generation, okay? And therefore, we're wrapping up this corruptedness, this crisis, this crap in the last 2 decades here. We're getting over it. And the polls just show most of the Republican voters don't agree with much of what the Republican leadership is want and going to do with or without them. You've got to think about that, okay? Because they're basically telling the rest of the non-Republicans, you're going to do what we say. You get us in office, we're going to take over, we're going to have a monarchy, we're going to have a dictator, you're going to do what we say. But I think what some of the Republicans are missing is that they don't even agree on a lot of that stuff. It's rather mixed and broken up. And yet, I don't think they've acknowledged yet that and realized they're also going to have to toe the line and go along with it. And this is why I don't think it'll work, because if you really study, especially on religion side, God doesn't want to force anybody into a religion because it's a poor link. It doesn't help God. And God needs us as much as we need God. It's a thing of building power and energy and be able to create something and do something and protect something. So God wants people to truly believe and walk in on their own and come with it. And that's why there's multiple religions, multiple gods, because someone decided, you know what, we got multiple types of people. We got to have a place for all of them, that if they're good, they deserve something, even if it's something different from someone else. Well, if you take that same psychology or whatever you want to call it and apply it to how we live in this world, you can see we've been doing that on again, off again, on again, whatever, throughout our history. And you can just see right the moment we go to a monarchy and dictatorship, it probably won't last only a few years and somebody's going to get thrown out or assassinated. Okay? And then we move on. But that doesn't mean they couldn't cause a different turn, some kind of paradigm shift within this, that it's not what we think. It may not be that progressive realism. Okay? But otherwise, my vote is, yeah, somehow we are going to pull together here a little better here in the 2030s and 2040s. And life goes on and the twists and turns. And like I say, my stock market model will make these twists and turns and commodities with or without all this stuff. But I think it's important enough to consider it's at least some kind of underlying tone. And I also think it's interesting to consider and be brave and optimistic if something great and wonderful could come out of this for decades to come. But then we also need to consider we're coming down to the final wire. There can be more crises now into 2030 or so, and then end, or maybe we're ready to end it now. And maybe it has something to do with this election. Past results are not necessarily indicative of future results. Have a great life. Let's start a new life cycle here. Let's put an end to this crisis. And here's for the election. All right, I'm Rich Paz for Critical Point. Thank you very much.